Have you stopped having your menstrual cycle? Has the menopause become a regular character in your daily life? Welcome, GynoCurious listeners. This is your host, Dr. Amy Novat. Virginia Reath, a physician's associate, is returning today to continue the conversation of that phenomenon, the menopause. Virginia and I have already done some episodes on the perimenopause and the changes in the vagina during these times. Today, we're kind of rounding out the conversations, if you will, by speaking about the big M, the menopause. So welcome, Virginia. Thank you for being here again. You're
Always
a steadfast
pleasure.
friend for GynoCurious. Thank you.
Always here.
And just to remind everyone out there, if you're asking yourself, I've always wanted to ask a question about menopause, or Amy and Virginia are not mentioning the following, why aren't they saying something? Please let us know what your thoughts and questions are. Send them to comments@radiofreerhiniecliff.org or call us at 845-307-7446. And if GynoCurious is doing a good job, if you're enjoying the show, please give us 5 stars, leave comments, share with friends on whatever app you're using. It really helps support the show and Radio Free Rhiniecliff to continue the work that we're doing. So here we go, Virginia, menopause. So I always like to start with definitions because your definition is my definition. They may be different, and technically the way we talk about it in medicine is different from the way most people out in the world talk about it. So just to remind people, menopause is actually just a point in time. It's literally our last menstrual period. Post-menopause is the time after. It's about saying, oh, I've gone a year, and that's the important, a year without bleeding. Then you're considered postmenopausal. But Virginia, don't you agree? Nobody really talks about the postmenopause. They say menopause.
Yeah, and I think also it's confusing because the postmenopause, I think, for many women is they consider it the end of symptoms.
Oh, interesting.
So the real menopause is not just the end of the menses.
Right.
It's because, of course, the thing that most women are concerned about is not the actual, period.
Right.
It's the symptoms they're having.
Yeah, no, it's
And so
true.
that's the part that can go on for years.
Right.
And I think so that's the part that's confusing. And most of the time I hear people talking about it, it's really, they're referring really to the, like women will say, oh, I'm postmenopause, meaning I left that era a long time ago. I'm not in that state. I'm not having those symphonies of symptoms anymore.
Oh, that's helpful. That's really helpful because
Yeah.
I hadn't actually thought of it in that way.
And
so
I
that's
also
helpful.
think the other thing we talked about once before, which is I think though medicine, I mean, it's a little, again, as I say, women are the walking science. So we're changing the science as we get more research.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea that you have to wait an entire year before you get to have the diagnosis of a menopause is kind of unfair because there are many symptoms that you can have prior to the actual end period. And lots of times, I mean, first of all, where are you at when you say it's the end? So you say, well, if you haven't had I've had patients who've come in and said, well, I was having all these symptoms and my period was 5 months ago. And the last clinician I saw wouldn't give me anything because they said I wasn't in menopause yet.
That's right.
And if this isn't menopause, I don't know what the fuck it is.
That's right. So I just had this new appreciation for my tendency to define things. And, I guess as a scientist, I like those clear-cut boundaries, but they're really, really not fair when we're talking about this phenomenon in particular. And as you pointed out, the symptoms of this array, this perimenopause, menopause, can start at so many different times in relation to that last menstrual period. Right. And yes, you are validating that those symptoms, that's what we're talking about, ladies out there. That's what we're trying to understand and help you with and identify because, again, the period can be really funky. I mean, again, you can go 5 months, you can go 8 months. I can't tell you how many women will say, I went 11 months and 2 weeks and then I got my period again. Am I starting all over again to have that definition, to have that diagnosis? And it's
Right,
not
and
really
I think the word you used is correct. It's a very narrow view,
Yes.
and it's not actually, it's not expansive, and it's not a listening perspective
Right.
of really what you're hearing.
right.
So there's a lot of clinicians that get really caught in that.
That's right.
And they basically won't address the issues with their patients because they're like, don't worry about it, you're not in menopause. It's like, don't worry about it. I'm not sleeping, I'm fat flushing, I'm sweating in the middle of the night. You know, you can't tell me this is nothing.
That's right.
But unfortunately, there are a lot of women who are being left, you know, outside the doctor's office going, what happened?
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, I thought I was going to get some help.
Right.
And then, of course, then there's, as we, you know, get into the topic, then there's the apprehension that a lot of clinicians have, like, well, how do I treat that?
I'm so glad you brought that up.
That's the real key then. It's like,
right.
well, I don't know. I don't want to put somebody too early on, well, what's my repertoire? What's my toolbox? Well, my toolbox is HRT.
Right. Right.
And then you have all these restrictions around HRT that we've been living with and trying to unpack and unfold over the last 10 years.
Exactly. So HRT is hormone replacement therapy for all of you out there. And it's so true. When I was learning about the menopause and hormone replacement therapy, it was so clear that you only talked about hormone replacement therapy when somebody had gone a year without a period. And I was, I participated in that. You're not there yet. You're not there. You're not there yet. Because that's how I'd been trained until finally I realized this is not working for my patients. This is not working for me. I feel helpless. And that's just, and there is stuff we can do.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that that's really important for women to know, also women's partners to know.
Yeah.
When you were asking for input from the audience, I would say, one of the things that, as I had my radio show many years ago, but we ended up getting a lot of male callers. Our show was a call-in show. So we got a lot of male callers who had questions that they had never been able to ask.
Yeah.
Because they didn't know about
Right.
what was happening to their wives or their partners or their girlfriends or their sisters or their mothers.
Which reminds me, those of you out there who are vulva havers,
Right.
if you want to share this episode with your partner or brother or whoever might have a penis nearby and you want to inform them and help them understand this, because it is really confusing. So let's just, let's talk about those symptoms of hot flushes or night sweats that's making the woman get up in the middle of the night, change clothes, change bedding, change beds. Or the change in libido where all of a sudden somebody who used to be really horny is no longer interested in sex. Or the person who used to be really quick, her brain was working so quickly and efficiently, who's saying, I'm forgetting stuff, or my brain feels foggy, or all of a sudden the woman who used to be, really easily able to maintain a certain weight, who all of a sudden is saying, what is happening to my body? What is happening to my weight? And these are things that women feel some shame around and don't understand. And so we're here to talk about them. So we're going to talk about them, but also let your partners, let your family know about this show. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think also, I really encourage a lot of my clients to do, what I call like the sit down. I even offer it to come in
Yep.
and like have a conversation
Yeah.
with a partner, because there's lots of times, as you say, there's a lot of shame around it.
Mm-hmm.
Also, there's a lot of not just confusion, there's a lot of erratic symptomology around this.
Comes and goes.
It comes and goes. So
Yep.
then you start feeling a little nuts,
That's right.
because you're like, you have 3 months that are just hell on wheels. And then boom, you feel fine for the next 6 months.
I've shared that with you, my
Yeah.
own personal
Right.
journey. I was, having every symptom under the sun, but I kept thinking they're going to go away. And then they would go away, and they'd go away for a few months, and then they'd come back and say, oh, they'll go away. So I didn't listen to myself in terms of taking
Right.
care of myself.
Well,
at that
I
time.
think, I can't remember if I told this story, but it's just a funny story that people tell on me. That when I was, I was still doing this work. It was a major piece of my practice was this work in hormone health, and but I remember I had a big trauma in my life. My actual business partner, my partner, had died, and unexpectedly in a really bad accident. And so I was just a mess after that. But anyway, I kept saying to, I kept getting really hot at the office. And I'd say to my nurse, I think I have that thing, that fever of unknown origin.
I have a temperature.
I think I have a temperature. And every day I would be like, you know what, I'm getting that temperature again. And I'm having, and then when we look back on it, I realized, what fever of unknown origin? That's like the shoemaker's shoes.
That's right,
I mean, here
exactly.
I'm sitting in this, I've got, hormone health things everywhere. And I'm like, what's wrong with me? I have a fever. It's like, no, honey, you got a hot flash.
There you go.
So that's also something, we can get in, we don't have to get into it right now, but one of the things that is true is that actually trauma can initiate a lot of hormonal irregularities. And I think we don't, I certainly know medicine doesn't pay attention to that at all.
No.
And it's really important. So if there's a death, or if there's an upheaval at home, or your kid, or your husband, or your partner, or your work, these things can exacerbate the symptomology. So,
you want to hear something really wild? I think about 5 or 10 women in my practice who have been long without menstrual cycles, years, who every year on the anniversary of either the death of a child or death of their spouse, some major loss, they have a bleed.
wow.
And
Now that's a study.
yes,
That would be a good research
It's so fascinating, and
Because,
I've gotten
of course,
so
immediately you go, okay, what about endometrial hyperplasia?
Right.
Did you do a workup?
Right,
And,
exactly, exactly. So, let's just dive a little deeper. But I want to say, before we talk about the symptoms, just to reiterate what they are, although I think I've already listed many of them, is, what's interesting for me also about this experience of the menopause is that there are women out there who are thrilled. They're like, yay, I'm not going to get pregnant anymore. Yay, I don't have to buy tampons. Yay, all that's behind me. And then there are women who feel a tremendous amount of grief, loss, that they are women who either weren't able to have biological children, or who had some relationship with their menstrual cycle that was very positive and invigorating and empowering. And so this concept that all women love it when they go through the menopause, just from the perspective of loss of bleeding, loss of menses, it's not true. So I share that with you because this is kind of a theater of many actors.
Right, and that's important because
Yeah.
I think that, yes, you also get, sometimes we can paint it also as being the hell of the menopause.
That's right.
And for a lot of women, remember, there are a good 20%, if not more, of women that don't have bad symptoms at all.
That's right.
So, and I think actually that's a good point that you bring up. I used to always say, and I still do, that menopause is often a real reckoning for women.
Yeah.
It's a very powerful time, in fact, for women to go through if they investigate it.
Yes.
And if they allow themselves to have the reflections, on their reproductive lives, on their losses, on their experiences of being, we live in such dynamic bodies. They're very different than male bodies. Mm-hmm. And so they've got all this activity happening and this also potential.
Right.
The reproductive potential.
Right.
It's not a destiny. It's more of an option.
I always think of it, we live such long lives now, and I have been heard to say it's no incident, it's no coincidence that we have this midlife phenomenon in the middle of our lives, that we get to use this shift, hormonal shift, physical shift, emotional shift, to say, what do I want ahead? How do I see being well, being healthy, dealing with whatever I'm dealing with in the next part of my lives?
Right, because of course the average age of the menopause, of the ending of a period, is the average is 53 to 54.
That's right.
So you're right after your 50th, where it's a big marker for a lot of women.
Right.
And they're looking often like they feel like, okay, now life is coming at me. Mm-hmm. I'm not going after it.
That's right.
And so I think that these are real things, and I think it's a place where our culture, our arts, we don't have really role models or ideas of women who are in this period. That's changing.
Yes.
But
thankfully.
I think for you and I, because we're of a similar age, that we didn't have that.
No.
And now
no.
we're getting more characters in novels and books and films where you're seeing it. But, that idea that we are, that we're rethinking, reevaluating, watching, recalibrating, all of this is also part of this time. So
That's
as you
right.
say, it's a theater of a lot of actors and a lot of acts.
That's right. That's right.
So-
What does it feel like to all of a sudden realize that your kids are out of the house? What's next? I've been doing a job for, a decade or two. What's next? I've been in a relationship that isn't that great or it's great. What's next? All these things start coming into this midlife phenomenon.
Right. But
So-
one of the things that I would want to say, and this will dive into the symptoms, because the one of the big issues that I also hear for women is the idea that all these symptoms can start to happen and life goes on. It doesn't
Speak more
stop
about that
for us.
Yeah, exactly.
So one of the things so we always talk about the menopause as the end of the period. So the end of the period means the end of the production of estrogen and progesterone and the decrease of the levels of testosterone. There's also these brain hormones, the pituitary hormones, which are LH and FSH. There's a lot of research that the hot flashing night sweats have to do with the LH factor. Again, that's around your ovulatory pituitary. So remember, in that cascade I think we talked about in the first one we did, that when we getting our period, we have this cascade of hormones that go from the hippocampus to the hypothalamus to the pituitary, bypassing the thyroid, because we can't forget the thyroid here, and then going to the ovary. So there's a lot of influencers here.
Yeah.
So sometimes what we see then is, and I do want to put a plug in, that women should be screened for thyroid disorder around the time of when they begin to have symptoms.
So let's just go there, because I think we've mentioned a lot of the symptoms and we can weave it in, but let's just talk, because it's so often asked of me, what should I do that I'm having these symptoms? Should I get testing done? So what are your thoughts about testing? You mentioned thyroid testing, and I totally
thyroid
agree.
is essential because thyroid is the most misdiagnosed condition in women over the age of 40.
And what's interesting out there is that a thyroid disorder often looks just like the perimenopause or postmenopause.
Exactly.
It mimics
symptoms.
It. Yeah.
You can have sleep disturbances. You can have temperature disturbances.
Weight
you can
changes.
have weight gain changes.
Yep.
You can have temperature changes.
Yeah.
So yes, thyroid's key, and a lot of people don't do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's important.
So ask
I
your
f-
practitioner to test your
Yeah.
thyroid, please.
I'm not a big fan of testing for the FSH and LH. I don't know how you feel about that, but a lot of doctors do it.
So-
FSH is the follicle stimulating hormone. LH is the luteinizing hormone.
So the only time I do those test for those two things is if I'm trying to understand, somebody comes in and their periods are just wacky every 5th month, 8th month, and they're like, when is it going to end? So even though the testing of the LH and FSH doesn't tell me exactly when they're going to have their last menstrual period, if those numbers reflect the post-menopause, both those numbers are really high, then I can at least say, listen, you're on the road. This
right. I think
this is
you
not
can
something
you
else.
can assess on the runway.
That's
but here's
right.
the problem with the FSH doing it. You're going to get an elevated FSH if you haven't had a period,
That's right.
because
That's right.
what's happening with that FSH is trying to stimulate the ovary to get an egg so you can have a period. So it gets kind of, I don't want to get too clinical here, but
Right.
there are ways in which you can look at, one of the things I do test is I'll try to find a mid-zone, and that's when I look for the lowering level of progesterone.
So you're testing
day
progesterone.
19 to 23 of the cycle. So I'm doing progesterone testing.
Mm-hmm.
That
Blood,
shows
saliva,
me
how are you doing it?
I usually, I used to do the saliva.
Mm-hmm.
I like to do saliva with, cortisol levels because it's excellent for that.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't do that so much anymore.
Yeah.
So I usually will ask for, sometimes I don't need to ask for testing. Sometimes it's really based on history.
That's
and what
right.
and what their symptoms are.
That's right.
And, after being in the field as long as I've been in, it's like, hey, I know what's going on.
But I want to say something to that, because women will often look at me like I don't know what I'm talking about when I say, really, the only test I want you to do is your thyroid. And they're like, wait a second, I read that you should test my estrogen level, my progesterone level, my testosterone level, etc. And, the trouble with that is even though we know that there's a diminution of these hormones with the menopause, that everyone's absolute volume or amount of these hormones in the body is also variable.
Well, also, it changes from morning to night.
That's
remember.
right. Day to day.
These are pulsatile
right.
hormones. So it's not a great marker.
No.
Honestly.
And if you
I mean, sometimes it's only what we've got, but it's really not a great marker. So it is frustrating to women, because then, of course, there are certain docs who will go in and do a huge, you'll see people who are doing the Dutch and people who are doing the
Dutch is a huge array of testing that's done by some practitioners.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and it has some value, especially for more complicated cases.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that you don't often need a whole blood bank done of testing.
Right.
What you want to do, and I think we need to clarify again, sort of symptoms, and then some things that you can do about those symptoms.
That's right.
And then also, what happens then when medical intervenes?
Right.
So, for instance, there's the most common one is the night sweats.
Right.
Okay. And the night sweats can range from being clammy to soaking wet. And I think that that's pretty, I didn't have night sweats, but I certainly had a lot of patients and family that did.
Mm-hmm.
And that's pretty devastating.
Right. So if you are, 48 or 51 or 54 and you come in and describe this phenomenon, we're not going to wonder what this is. We know what it is.
Right.
This is the menopause. Right.
And you can have this in the perimenopause too.
Oh, for sure. For sure.
So hot flashes are a little different. Hot flashes are what they consider a flushing. So the face can get very red, the neck, you feel your whole body heat go up in kind of raising elements of heat. Like you really, like somebody's just put blankets on you and sweaters on you and down jackets on you.
And you want to get stripped.
And you're like, get me out of here.
Right.
So you can strip everything off, and you'll hear women say, yeah, great, I'm really sleeping well because I'm up, tearing off the bedclothes.
Right.
Or I'm opening the window, tearing off the bedclothes, or I'm freezing, then I'm chilled, then I'm hot. So lots of times hot flashes can be precipitated by a chill, which is, if you think about these things, and I think I said this once before, these are interruptions to the brain.
Right.
So now you've got an acute episode that the brain is trying to manage. Are you hot? Are you cold? What do we do?
And again, it's not a fever. That's not what we're talking about. That's a whole different mechanism.
It's not a fever.
Yeah.
But what happens is that now you've got sleep disturbances.
Right.
Because your brain's in activity. You have to get up. You're out. You're doing all this stuff.
But I want to remind people that you might have sleep disturbances without night sweats or
true.
Sleep.
But that's this. Sleep issues is a big common issue with that.
Yep.
So, do you want to list them, or should we go into symptoms?
Why don't you give a list of the symptoms that we often see, and then we're going to talk about how we help women with these.
Certain remedies and things like that. So there's just jump in then.
Yeah.
Hot flashes, hot sweat, night sweats. Mm-hmm. Sleep issues.
Mm-hmm. Vaginal changes, which we talked about, drying, more irritated, stinging, itching, pain, discomfort vaginally. A loss of libido or horniness.
Yeah, loss of libido, a loss of also the ability to reach orgasm.
That's right.
Feels like muffled.
A
lot of women will talk about it as if their clitoris feels it's got like all these blankets on top of it.
That's right.
Okay, there's that.
Headaches, hair changes, brain
changes.
fog.
Brain fog's a big one.
Yep. And weight. That's a big one.
And weight is a big one. Yep. So women will tend to gain weight. We tend to always gain weight a certain amount during our decades. But what you'll often hear is what is known in my lexicon as the menopot, which is a kind of upper belly thickening, and it's often firm, hard. It's not soft. It's not squishy fat. It feels like, what the hell is that?
Mm-hmm.
So that thickening in the midriff, also widening in the hips and in the belly.
Yep.
The other thing that a lot of women really freak out about is, holy goddamn, my breasts are getting bigger.
For some bigger, for some
Smaller.
just droopier.
Right,
Yeah.
droopier. But a lot of women get
Yeah.
denser, fuller breasts,
Yeah.
and that is so confusing for women.
Yeah.
Some of them was like, this is great until, what's going on
Right.
with this?
I have to change bras.
Yeah.
I no longer am comfortable
Right.
doing
Do
my
I have
runs.
to? Do I have to do should I be doing a mammogram? Is this a problem?
Right. Right.
So,
So again, there's this
think
vast array.
that's kind of
Yeah.
Is that the majority? I think
Yeah,
that's the
those are the-
majority of the symptoms that I did mention. Brain fog and
Mm-hmm.
brain fog. Oh, well, lots of women will talk to you also about they're losing words. They experience aphasia more commonly.
Memory issues.
And the problem often there is we tend to panic around that issue in
Yes.
particular.
Yes, we do.
So when something happens where you can't remember, it's not you. What I always try to explain is, think about the synapses in your brain. If you're getting panicked when you can't remember something, you're interrupting that smooth synapse. And the problem also is that these events in our lives, these physical events, also interrupt our synapses. So our brains feel a bit scrambled, and in fact they are, or they can be. Let me put it that way.
So just kind of a metaphor, if you will, is kind of the road is smooth and everything around you as you're driving along, you see and you can describe. And then all of a sudden there are a lot of bumps in the road, and you're getting distracted by those bumps because it's jostling your car. So you may not be looking to the right the same way because off to the left is this huge bump or hole. So I always try to allay women's fears by saying, listen, one, it's incredibly common as we age for us to forget some words, as long as they come back, and they do come back. So, for example, if you're looking at the tissue box on your counter and you're like, what is that thing called again? That's one thing. And more often than not, women will say, oh, yeah, 10 minutes later, I was like, tissue box. It's if you look at that tissue box and you're like, I not only don't know what it's called, but I don't know what it's used for. Then that's a very different form of memory loss. And what I always say to women, because this does panic all of us, is if you feel like you're getting to the place where you're forgetting so much, or family members, loved ones, friends are saying, you just aren't remembering things, then please go to not your gynecologist. They're not people who are expert in memories per se, but go to a neurologist, go to your primary care doctor. There are an array of tests that can be done to better understand whether it's true memory loss, whether it's just associated with aging. Is it that you're so distracted by something else in your life that your brain's just not working so well right now?
There is a sort of stressors that occur with a lot of these symptoms.
Sure.
So you can, and as I said earlier, life doesn't stop because you have them. So also the 50s and 60s for women are rough. I mean, older parents, children going through transitions, economic solvency, housing. I mean,
it's a busy time.
It's a busy time, and it doesn't stop for us because we're having symptoms.
Yeah.
And, so that's partly what puts us on edge and partly what puts us into one of the things that I know we wanted to mention, which is adrenal issues.
Yeah, yeah.
So there's a lot of talk about adrenal fatigue and adrenal energy and adrenal health. And I think it's a very interesting field. It hasn't really rounded itself out yet as a full science with clear parameters of what to do. There are products that I've used that I feel can really be helpful. You can also have your cortisol levels done. Saliva is probably the best way, but you can have them.
So cortisol is a hormone that comes from our adrenal glands and can be a measure of stress, can be a measure of adrenal fatigue. adrenal dysfunction, if you will.
Right.
Yeah.
And so one of the things with this, the cacophony of these symptoms all put together, somebody can really be having a rough time.
Yeah.
And so you can see, and again, sleep deprivation and all of that happening. And you can see somebody who either is just can't get out of bed. You know, sometimes it looks like depression. Sometimes it's just exhaustion. Sometimes it's racing at night, you can't sleep.
Yeah.
So it does exist. We know cortisol. The other thing about cortisol that's important is cortisol, when, you know, in the days of the woolly mammoth, the cortisol actually, you know, when we saw that, we ran and we had to be physically active. We are not as physical in our worlds these days. So we tend to sit more and chew more and stew more, okay? And that's part of one of the big things around the adrenal health is some of this weight issue, is that you're getting this sort of thicker, denser fat coming from adrenal. And so trying to work on calming yourself, on meditation techniques, on getting better sleep, these things, on better nutrition, in general self-care, these things will help lower those levels of cortisol.
So I think we're going to come to a close here because there's so much we can talk about in terms of treatments.
Right.
So I'm just going to say briefly, you know, that the most important thing that we remind everyone out there is, one, there are treatments, and they can be everything from conventional hormone replacement therapy, bioidentical hormones. There are a multitude of herbs, plant chemicals that can help support women. There are medications that women who can't take estrogen can use. There are medicines that work directly on the brain now, something called Veoza. There are a multitude of products out there, so it is not without help. There are some women who will use something called an SSRI. This is a medicine that's typically used for depression, but in small doses can really help with hot flushes. Neurontin, a movement disorder medication. So I'm being quick here, and I apologize to the audience, but I want you to know that there is this long list. And so when you have a physician or a clinician who says to you, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not sure what I'm going to do for you," you either just walk out the door or, you know, say, "Hey, listen, I heard this whole long list and Dr. Novad and Virginia Reath didn't go into what each one of them do, but I know they're there. So what are my options?" So please ask. And again, I want to just reiterate, for those who can't take estrogen because of a history of breast cancer or intolerance to estrogen, there are ways to assist you in this array of symptoms and way of being. And I also want to remind everyone out there that all these symptoms tend to go away. There are women, there's about a 15% group of women who will have sweats throughout their lives until they die at 90, but they always say to me, "Oh, they're so much less intense. There's so much, they're
you do have an occasional superheater.
Yeah, there you go.
But it's occasional.
Exactly. Yeah. So this is not the way you're going to live your life forever or until the day you die, but it can last for years. So, Virginia, is there anything else you want to just make sure we say before we say goodbye?
Yeah, I just think it would be, I think you're suggesting it, but I do think it would be helpful for us to come back at some point and go over the different modalities that you can use so this list doesn't sort of float in the sky of like, well, what was that?
That's right. No, so we will do that.
We will be returning, but it is, again, there are definite things you can do. There are definite ways in which you can feel better. And also, you know, talk to your friends and talk to your sisters and your girlfriends and your book clubs, and ask also your mother. I mean, you know, ask her when she got her period, if you can. That piece of it is interesting, and it does have some bearing on your experience.
But speak out loud about it. That's what we're saying. Speak out loud about it. Right. And thankfully, we are at a time where, you know, the menopause is being talked about much, much more. So there is no shame. There's, you know, we are amazing creatures, and we go through this experience and we survive, but it is certainly can be extremely difficult for some.
Right.
Virginia,
we will carry on.
we will carry on as we do through all kinds of challenges. Virginia, thank you again. You are just
Always
an
fun.
abundance of information, and I so appreciate it. Thank you also to my producers, Jen Hammoud and Matty Rosenberg, and to the Epicurean, who very kindly provides the space for the show and supports Radio Free Rhiniecliff. Until our next conversation, please be healthy, and please remember to relish your instincts and intuitions. They are the greatest of teachers, not to be ignored.